This is the story of La Befana and the Royal Child of Light. It's a story that comes from Italy, just like my mother's family. And it's a story that really beautifully represents the combination in Italian culture of old ways, Roman ways, and even pre-Roman ways, and the newer Christian church with its beliefs and stories and symbols. And as when Christianity was new and newly beginning to spread around Italy, many of the old symbols and festivals and practices from the old beliefs and spirituality were adopted and adapted to the Christian story. One notable one of those for the moment of the year that we are in now is the transition from the old belief in a sun god named Mithra, who was referred to as the rising one or the unconquered sun, S-U-N, began to blend with Jesus, who was called the light of the world. And the church even adopted Mithra's birthday, December 25th, as the birthday of the new Christ child. And it's fitting because it's all about the returning of the light. Yesu as the light of the world and Mithra as the rising sun. They're holding hands. The story of La Befana that I'm going to share today is one of many stories about her. La Befana is a mythological figure, sometimes thought of as a witch and seen in a negative light, but also seen as maybe a fairy or some other supernatural force. The story I'm going to tell comes from about the 12th or 13th century. So well into this combining of old and new ways. And the word Befana means epiphany. And there are a few different meanings of that word, epiphany. The first is the Feast of the Epiphany in Christianity, also known as the Feast of the Three Kings. Another definition is manifestation of a divine or supernatural being. Epiphany, manifestation of a divine or supernatural being. And the third is a moment of sudden revelation or insight. And I think our story today has all three of these meanings. So let's begin. La Befana is a tall old woman with white hair, long fingers, and a red shawl wrapped around her shoulder. In her hand, she holds a bent branch broom. She has a hump on her back and brown speckles like chocolate on the backs of her hands. And she lives in a thin wooden house in the shadows of the mulberry trees, on a street lined with mulberry trees. In the kitchen of her house, there are libraries of jars and tins, different sweets, honey, almonds, hazelnuts, the dried skins of citrus fruits, cloves, vanilla beans, cinnamon, mountains and hills of sugar and flour. And until the winter where our story takes place, La Befana had swept and baked only for herself, alone in her house. Sweep, swept, sweep. Day after year, year after day. La Befana never spoke. She was silent. The other people who lived around her heard her noises, but they never heard her voice, or at least they couldn't remember the last time they'd heard it. But one year, in deep winter, La Befana had a conversation, and it changed her life forever. Well, one morning on this winter, a strange parade began to come down the Mulberry Street. The people everywhere came out and were watching and looking. They were crowding around, wanting to know what was going on. Not La Befana. La Befana stayed inside. She stayed inside of her humble home, but she did open the curtains and peek out, also wanting to see what was happening on this most peculiar morning. And what she saw were huge, enormous brown clopping beasts with knobby knees and humps on their backs, carrying carved wooden cases with suns and crescents on the sides. And there were jewel-colored flags flying in the street, and there was a procession. At the front of the procession was an old man in a deep red turban, and at the middle was a slightly younger man, swathed in purple. And at the very end was an even younger man with green robes, the colors of orange tree leaves. And there were also two little boys in the procession who were following along and making music, dancing and calling out to the people. Befana's breath began to frost her window pane as she looked out, and so she reached up with her fingers and she wiped it away. And at that moment, everyone saw a little child ran out from the procession, and he began to run to her door. Tap, 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 ran his feet, and he reached her door and he knocked. Knock, neck, knock on La Befana's door. And she cracked the door just a crack, and then she opened it wider, wide enough to show herself, clutching her bent branch broom. The music stopped. The parade paused in the street. It was as if even the strangers knew La Befana needed the silence to find her voice. And then everyone saw the little boy reach for her hand that was clutching the broom, and they saw her fingers tighten a little bit more. But she did reach out with her other hand and took the boy's small one in his. Well, the people puffed up with breath they did not let out. The child spoke first, and he said, "We're looking for the child of light, Nonna, the royal child who will light up the world." The people watching, their breath went out and their breath went in. "Eh?" La Befana said. "We're looking for the child of light, Nonna. Come with us. We're bringing the royal child our gifts." La Befana was silent. "Come, Nonna, andiamo," and with a voice husky from many years of no use, La Befana said, I have my sweeping. And the boy said, come. I have my baking, child. I must gather wood for the fire. The boy simply reached out his arms and gathered them around her long gray skirts and held her and embraced her. And everyone saw La Befana loosen her grip on the broom, set it aside, and reach her own old chocolate speckled hands down around the child's back. And she embraced him as well. And in a moment, it was as if the scene that had paused began to come back to life. The music began again, and people began to move. The animals were walking, and the parade began again. The boy released his grip on La Befana, and he scampered back towards the parade. And there she stood for a moment in silence. And then she clutched her broom and she shut her door hard. Now, if you had been listening at her door, you would have heard her go back to her usual sweeping, sweep, swept, sweep. Sweep, swept, sweep. But now and then, perhaps a little slower. A few more pauses, as if she were leaning and thinking. And if you had peered in her window, you would have seen her standing there with her broom, dreaming, her eyes like dark chocolate melting. Those chocolate eyes reflected in all the tiny tins and jars in her kitchen. Still. Until after a moment, she blinked. And she moved, and she set aside her broom, and the next thing you knew, lids and tins were flying. Her rolling pin was dancing across the countertop. Eggs were bursting into brightly colored bowls, and she began to beat them, beat, bet, beat, and knead, knock, knead, as she began to make dough, and cookies, and cakes, and sweets, and treats of all kind. Cloves and cinnamon were swirling through the air, the rinds of oranges and nectarines scattered like commas and parentheses onto the blank pages of dough she had made. Vanilla beans were shivering in snowy sugar. Almonds and hazelnuts were cavorting in honey, the cream was frothing, and chocolate slivers from the backs of her hands spun out to sweeten her desserts. And soon the hot oven mouth was closing on them all. Then, when they were baked in a cloud of delicious perfume, La Befana packed a basket, layer upon layer of pies and cakes, candies and cookies, the result of her many long years of baking. Then, are you watching? She smoothed back her white hair, and she fastened her red cloak around her shoulders, and she rested her fingers for a moment on her eyes. And then she picked up her basket and ran out the door, back towards the mulberry street, back towards the parade. She has her gifts ready now for the royal child. But the parade has long since passed. All that's left in the street is a ribbon or two, and the light is fading from the sky. She doesn't know. Will she be able to catch up? Has she missed her moment? And as she stands there, a mulberry leaf falls, settling at her feet like a crown. She dashes back into her house and grabs her broom and comes out running, broom in one hand, basket in the other. And she began to run and run, her basket bumping against her side. She's picking up speed. She's losing her breath. She begins to wheeze. She runs and runs until a breeze comes and lifts her. And her broom begins to tilt and lift until up and up and up she flies into the stars. La Bufana is a tall old woman with a bent branch broom. She lives in the shadow of the mulberry trees. And she bakes, and she sweeps, and she gathers wood. And she speaks hardly at all. But every year since that winter, every year she packs her basket full of gifts for the royal child of light. La Befana never catches up to the parade, but still she flies each year across the sky from the Alps to Sicily, stopping at every house below. She is looking for the child who will light up the world. And now she's never sure just exactly what that child will look like. And so, to be safe, she leaves gifts at every home, just in case the child within is the royal child of light. I hope some rays of light from this story have reached out through the screen and through the ages to touch your heart today. And I hope that you will join me in feeding this story and keeping this story alive and healthy and growing by maybe sharing a comment about what spoke to you, what stood out, what shining ray of light is going home with you today. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this story with me, La Befana and the Royal Child of Light.